So your absolute risk increase if you use Tylenol during pregnancy is about 0.3%, which means 333 women would have to take Tylenol during pregnancy in order for one of those offspring to develop autism that otherwise wouldn't have. Hopefully that helps to explain why this unilateral take on Tylenol being bad in pregnancy was a really poor message to send out to the American public. Or, put more simply,
if you need help like this guy, call your own doctor.
All right, I want to make a short video on this current controversy surrounding the research implicating a correlation between Tylenol use in pregnancy and autism. I must preface this with the message that I am not an OBGYN, I am not an autism researcher, and I am not an expert on medication exposures in pregnancy, though I will try to get Adam Urato on soon to comment for us. Here's my opinion. We don't know what the association found in several studies between Tylenol use in pregnancy and autism means yet. There just isn't enough data to confirm one way or another, and it seems to me that any efforts to do so on both sides are succumbing to the modern and intense climate of political polarization. Like, don't get me wrong, this is important research. It does warrant more investigation into whether Tylenol use in pregnancy is causative or not, but it's time to pump the brakes on the assertion that Tylenol use in pregnancy is the cause of autism. Nobody should feel like they have to declare victory on behalf of their political ideology one way or another in a scientific argument of this magnitude. And actually, let's pump the brakes on there being this magical singular cause of autism, as it's undoubtedly more complex than that, with cause being a multifaceted mixture of genetic and environmental factors, with pro-inflammatory states possibly being necessary in its development. The real question the doctors, providers, researchers, and scientists are asking, in my mind, in my professional opinion, is whether or not maternal Tylenol use in pregnancy contributes directly in some form or fashion to the development of autism. There are several other potential confounding factors that could explain the findings of this recent Harvard review of self-reports of pregnant women's Tylenol exposure during pregnancy and whether their offspring ended up developing autism. Assertively commanding pregnant women, don't take it, especially from the mouth of someone who is not an OBGYN and further does not have a medical degree, is inappropriate. While intimidation may actually be a useful negotiating tactic in some political and foreign affairs, only asking for an extreme measure for the sake of accepting a less extreme compromise, using this tactic with medical advice from somebody with no medical training or experience is somewhat asinine. At least have one of the medical doctors make the announcement and provide some of the appropriate nuance required around this discussion. You can tell the people that an association or correlation has been found without advising all American pregnant women to stop using Tylenol entirely. The risk of telling pregnant women to not take it, with the implication being under any circumstances if you can, is that if pregnant women with fevers or severe pain don't take Tylenol, both of these untreated have been associated with adverse fetal and maternal outcomes in pregnancy. The smartest and most capable physicians I've ever worked with or interviewed on Renegade Psych, the so-called experts in medicine, rarely have such polarizing takes. And theoretically, this message against Tylenol could be directly harmful if this autism Tylenol association turns out to be better explained by mothers being in higher systemic states of inflammation during pregnancy as the reason why they're taking more Tylenol. And stopping it could cause increases in inflammation. Though I will say, I do like the general lead-in message on the White House official website press release that states, "The Trump administration does not believe popping pills is always the answer for better health." But again, using that as part of the justification for recommending totally against Tylenol use in pregnancy, not a big fan. Imagine this in parallel to these findings. What if I told you that seeking mental health treatment was associated with higher risks of suicide, psychosis, and inpatient psychiatric hospitalization? Well, this is likely true because those with pre-existing struggles with their mental health are likely more often going to seek help from a professional, whereas those who are not seeking help are probably at their baseline not at a high risk for dying by suicide, becoming psychotic, or being hospitalized for mental health reasons. Does this mean that seeking mental health treatment causes suicide, psychosis, and inpatient psychiatric hospitalization? No. Though part of me does think it's ironic as I ask that question, because I do think some suicide, psychotic episodes, and inpatient hospitalizations are the direct result of adverse effects of psychiatric medications. But the point there being, there are so many potential confounders in this study. This association could be a red herring. Some of the confounders, or alternative reasons for the association, were at least attempted to be addressed and discussed briefly in the paper. But it's nearly impossible to control for all confounders or trust that your methods of controlling for confounders are perfect, especially in smaller studies. A non-complete list of confounders might include maybe moms who take Tylenol more often are having more fevers and or viral infections that are more directly causing systemic or neuroinflammation that's increasing the risk of that fetus developing autism and or negatively affecting brain development. Maybe it's the pain signals, a form of stress or other forms of emotional, physical, or spiritual stress that drive Tylenol use. And the association is actually with some unnamed or unrecognized stressor. Inflammation has been highly implicated as a massive risk factor, possibly necessary for autism. And our renegade psych autism expert, Dr. Jamie Shoup, holds a belief that early and repetitive high inflammatory states are linked to and lead to autism and other early life neurodevelopmental disorders. Maybe mothers that are taking Tylenol are more likely to expose themselves to other medications, substances, or environmental toxins. Maybe mothers who reach for Tylenol with milder symptoms have certain character traits that predispose their children genetically or environmentally to autism, or both genetic and environmental influence. Maybe moms who refuse to take Tylenol during pregnancy are also managing their pregnancies better in terms of less exposure to substances during pregnancy, or they're managing their stress and anxiety levels better, or they have some secret sauce that allows them to be healthier throughout pregnancy. Maybe self-reports aren't as accurate as the authors may think. Maybe the evaluative tools that are the standard in statistical analyses aren't perfect. There's a lot of other potential explanations for these findings. Let's take a look at a couple of the studies themselves in more detail. The review out of Harvard was a meta-analysis of 46 different studies based on moms' self-reported acetaminophen or Tylenol, or paracetamol for some of our viewers and listeners abroad, use during pregnancy. Of these 46 studies, 27 showed a positive association between Tylenol use in pregnancy and the later development of autism, ADHD, and neurodevelopmental disorders in those offspring. 9 studies showed no association, And 4 studies showed a negative, or actually a protective association of mothers' use of Tylenol during pregnancy, leading to lower rates of neurodevelopmental disorders. And then, of course, there had to be another nebulous 6 studies that I didn't see obviously commented on. I hate it when researchers don't fill in the obvious gaps and leave my brain obsessing over unaccounted for basic math. In totality, they found a relative risk of 1.19 in autism and 1.34 in ADHD, which means that the risk of developing autism with exposure to Tylenol during pregnancy is 1.19 times higher and 1.34 times higher. Every 1 fetus that goes on to develop autism without Tylenol exposure, 1.19 fetuses will go on to develop autism with a Tylenol exposure. Another example, or another way of putting it, women who smoke are 8 to 10 times more likely to develop lung cancer throughout their lifetime than women who don't smoke. That is, their relative risk of developing lung cancer based on the habit of smoking is 8 to 10 times higher. But when you break that down into absolute terms, only about 11% of women who smoke will develop lung cancer in their lifetime, versus about 1.3% of women who don't smoke. So while smoking doesn't guarantee somebody's going to develop lung cancer, they are 8 to 10 times more likely than the woman who doesn't smoke. Though, notably, 88.8% of women who do smoke won't develop lung cancer. So let me see if I can explain this to you numerically in terms of relative risk versus absolute risk. Absolute risk is the overall change in how many kids will go on to develop autism if their mothers are using Tylenol during pregnancy. If around 1.5% of births will yield offspring with a diagnosis of autism, just in general, regardless of Tylenol exposure, and Tylenol exposure increases that risk by 1.2 times, then the overall risk of developing autism by using Tylenol, doing it right here, is about 1.8%. So your absolute risk increase if you use Tylenol during pregnancy is about 0.3%. Now, let's use another statistic, something called the number needed to harm, aka how many women have to use Tylenol during pregnancy to cause 1 case of autism. And so we do that by doing 1 divided by the absolute risk, which is 0.3%, and numerically that's 0.003, which means, again, based on the findings of this study, that 333 women would have to take Tylenol during pregnancy in order for 1 of those offspring to develop autism that otherwise wouldn't have. Hopefully that helps to explain why this unilateral take on Tylenol being bad in pregnancy was a really poor message to send out to the American public. Theoretically, if Tylenol was a perfect example, that would mean that all Tylenol exposures lead to autism and no autism develops without prenatal Tylenol exposure. Then all autism spectrum cases would be in the Tylenol exposed group. But this is not the case, and it points to the fact that there are other causative factors. There are other things that will be correlated. And on top of that, relative risks very close to 1 are not that large, they're not that impressive in research, and they're really not that convincing. However, it is notable that this study did find that longer and more consistent reported use increased the risk. And the reason for that finding is a question that needs to be further investigated. All right, let's move on to in my opinion, a better 2019 Johns Hopkins study where researchers measured Tylenol and its metabolites or breakdown products in the umbilical cord blood samples of almost 1,000 individual births. a biomarker of acetaminophen or Tylenol use during pregnancy. Side note, it'd be interesting to compare the biomarker findings to the self-report findings of use to see if there's any discrepancy. Interestingly, in this Johns Hopkins study, every sample contains some level of acetaminophen, indicating to me that there's likely universal exposure in the groundwater, as it's unimaginable that all 1,000 moms took Tylenol during pregnancy. So the researchers then divided the sample into 3 groups based on level of exposure, with the highest group having a nearly 3.5 times increased risk of autism and nearly 3 times risk of ADHD compared to the lowest group. Because remember, everybody had acetaminophen at some level in the cord blood. Despite this stronger association found in this study than in the more recent Harvard study, and the fact that this occurred 6 years ago, one of the corresponding authors, Xiaobin Wang, hope I pronounced that correctly, cited it should not be interpreted that Tylenol causes these disorders. More studies are clearly needed to further clarify the concern. Parents and providers may want to consider the benefit and potential risk when making a decision on the use of acetaminophen during pregnancy or the peripartum period. Don't get me wrong here. In terms of the researchers' efforts, they are important. And they do try to control for all of these potential confounding factors like level of inflammation, alcohol, nicotine, substance use, general health outcomes and medical disorders, age at delivery, preterm birth, childhood lead exposure, stress, fever, delivery type. But these controls are far from perfect, and it's hard to perfectly match to controls in a study of less than 1,000 people or less than 1,000 pregnant mothers. We would either need a much more overwhelming amount of non-mechanism of action proof that Tylenol is a likely contributory cause to autism, or a more definitive mechanism of action, not just speculative or theoretical mechanisms, before we can say that Tylenol causes autism. Now, as a medical doctor and psychiatrist who treats adults with autism and ADHD daily, but not an OBGYN, and not my colleague and expert on medication exposure during pregnancy, Adam Urato, who I can't wait to have back on to give his opinion on this topic. What I do wish is that the president and HHS Secretary RFK Jr. would have said, well, like most things in medicine and seemingly in America, I just wish they would have provided some nuance. A statement like this would have been appropriate in my eyes. There have been a concerning number of studies suggesting a correlation between pregnant women's use of large amounts of Tylenol, especially in the 3rd trimester, with the child later developing autism, ADHD, and other neurodevelopmental disorders. While this is not proof of causation, we thought it was important enough to educate the public so mothers, their families, and their treatment providers can work together to make the most informed decisions about their prenatal care, as opposed to 3 words, don't do it. Now, this issue, I think, speaks to a larger issue in politics that's also invading medicine, and I don't actually blame people for taking a black and white, red or blue, all or nothing, causes it or doesn't cause it approach, because that's what I think our minds crave. To take all this complex mess of information we're exposed to and sort it down into something much simpler. So while my mind desires, like everyone else, to make certainty out of an uncertain mess, our conscious self, our frontal lobes, have to be able to find the middle ground, find the gray, find the purple, find the nuance in all of these arguments, and stop falling victim to there only being 2 sides. So I'm going to start calling more aggressively from my platform, which is small. And by the way, if you're listening to this or watching it, please share with others. My messages are not ones that generate a lot of profits for the industries that drive the YouTube and Google search algorithms, and I just think it's likely mine will be suppressed. So please, please, please share and engage with the channel however possible. And so the last thing I'll say here, I'm going to start more aggressively calling for open and civilized debates in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination, which was an absolutely horrific illustration of our country's level of dysfunction and divisiveness. And not to say that I agree with all of Charlie Kirk's philosophies, some of which I vehemently disagree with, and others which I wholeheartedly agree with. But we need a public forum to hear the experts that disagree with each other on important, specific topics where they sit across the table from one another or sit across a computer screen and they debate in a civilized manner, and we make these conversations public. We put them on TV. We put them on the internet. Let the people watch the experts cite their data and make their points, not politicians. So often in medicine, but really in life in general, answers are not as simple as our minds and subsequently we make them out to be. Thanks for listening. Hope you keep coming back and keep engaging with the channel.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for informational purposes only. The information provided in this podcast and related materials are meant only to educate. This information is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice. While I am a medical doctor and many of my guests have extensive medical training and experience, nothing stated in this podcast nor materials related to this podcast, including recommended websites, texts, graphics, images, or any other materials, should be treated as a substitute for professional, medical, or psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All listeners should consult with a medical professional, licensed mental health provider, or other healthcare provider if seeking medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
Or, put more simply,
If you need help like this guy, call your own doctor.
thanks again for watching and or listening. If you're passionate about the subjects that I discuss on the channel, do me a favor and like, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to make your voice heard, that these are problems that must be addressed in our society. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I want to hear them. Feel free to reach out on social media or email us at renegadepsych@gmail.com. And if you'd like to be a guest of the show or you have a connection to somebody that you think would be a good guest, let us know. Thanks again for listening.